Will Allen was raised on a farm in Southern California. After serving in the Marine Corps, he received a PhD in anthropology and then taught at UC Santa Barbara before being fired and then jailed for a year of civil rights and anti-war activism. Will has been farming organically since 1972, and so he understands the adverse impact that commercialization has had on our nation's farmers. The increased demands for greater productivity and increased crop output have left farmers a target for media campaigns by corporations promoting their deadly chemicals, hormones, and genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. Will Allen's War on Bugs details how consumers and activists have struggled against toxic food and sounds a clarion call to stop poisoning our food, water, air, and ourselves. Will founded the Sustainable Cotton Project and is a board member of the Organic Consumers Association, Rural Vermont, and is a co-chair of Farms Not Arms. He currently co-manages a 50-acre farm in Vermont with his wife, Kate Duesterberg. Please welcome Will Allen.
Thanks a lot. Thanks to Bioneers for inviting me, and to Chelsea Green for promoting me to do this. They've been very supportive, and I really appreciate it with not just my book project, but with a lot of projects that I'm working on, including Farms Not Arms. I guess after hearing Naomi, I'd like to talk about something else. But I'm going to talk about our farm and the war on bugs that we're trying to present right now as a book. We're almost finished with it. It's taking a lot of time because there's lots of illustrations. And you're going to see some of those today. Give you a little bit of history about the war on bugs. And for a long time I did the Sustainable Cotton Project. And we were trying to teach cotton growers how to not use chemicals. And I had been an organic farmer for a long time, and so we had figured out on our farms how to not use chemicals. And since I was in a cotton growing area and the farm I worked on grew cotton, we experimented around a lot with not using chemicals. And so we got this idea of we would show people how toxic cotton production and farm production in general in California were, and so we started this series of bus tours, and we gave about 1,000 officials, congressmen, mayors, CEOs from all the clothing companies in this country and some in Europe, tours of cotton country to show them how toxic the fiber that they were using was. And in almost every bus tour we took, we would see 10 or 11 crop dusters in the air at a time. Could you change the next slide, please? And not just one crop duster, but 6, 7, 10 crop dusters at a time. And they'd be flying over rivers and canals and schools and ponds and lakes and houses, as well as fields. And every crop duster that we followed leaked, so that even when they weren't spraying, they were spraying. And we followed them with National Geographic for 2 weeks, and we followed 200 crop dusters, and every single one of them leaked from the time that they left the field where they filled up until they arrived at the site where they were going to spray. And so people began asking me all the time, well, how do people get to this place where they could use all these poisons on themselves? And I really didn't have an answer. I mean, how did people get comfortable with spraying poison on their kids and on their farms and on their houses and on their lawns? And everybody said, oh, well, it started after the Second World War because after the Second World War we had all these Green Revolution chemicals, and the Green Revolution chemicals didn't ever exist before, and so after the Second World War, agriculture dramatically changed. And agriculture did dramatically change after the Second World War, but as I started looking at this, I realized that the change occurred much earlier than that. And a lot of friends of mine that were older farmers had old collections of farm magazines. And so I started going through all these old collections of farm magazines, and I can't say that that was a chore. It was totally fun, because you found this stuff in these old farm magazines that you wouldn't believe that they would say. Just totally arrogant about, we have the right to use these chemicals. And I kept going back and back, and finally I ran out of neighbors that had old farm magazines, and so I started going to the library at the University of California, Davis. And lo and behold, there were all of these histories of how we got to this place. And so I started looking at it and realizing that the first farm journal was 1810. And it only lasted a year. And then in 1819, 2 other farm journals were created. And when that happened, the focus of agriculture was organic. The focus of agriculture was rotation of your fields, deep plowing, composted manure, cover crops for fertility, and basically the same kind of organic system we have now. I mean, ours is better because we've figured out a lot more things over long periods of time, but they were fairly sophisticated not long after the turn of the century. Not this century, but the 1700s to 1800s. And so I started looking at all of this stuff and realized that the first advertisement for off-farm fertilizer came in 1824. Can you give me the next slide, please? This is like a cartoon from the Vietnam War era by a cartoonist by the name of Oliphant. And he was very effective. And this is 2,4,5-T, which was one of the ingredients of Agent Orange in Vietnam. But it's also was a very commonly used pesticide on farms. And so at the top, you can't quite see it, but at the top of the slide, it's all these locations in Vietnam, and then the last one is Globe, Arizona. I mean, so the same kind of, attitude that we had towards the Vietnam countryside and the forest, we also have towards our farm community. Next slide, please. So I wanted to find out, well, how did, the culture start changing so that this would happen? And, most of the people came to the United States as servants and slaves. 2/3 of the people that came to Philadelphia, which was the most liberal state after the 1800s until 1870, came as servants and slaves. And even as late as 1832, like 3/4 of the people that came to the rest of the states were slaves. Next slide, please. And this is the kind of farming that was common when they came here. And it was mainly a agriculture that was focused on herd animals, grains, and grasses to feed those herd animals. And even though Muslim agriculture had advanced dramatically by this time and had a lot of irrigated agriculture and a lot more vegetables and fruit trees in their agriculture than Europe did, Europe stayed in kind of a Roman focused agriculture up until the time that they immigrated to the Americas. Next slide, please. Now in Europe, advertising was much more advanced than it was in the United States, and by the 1600s there were advertisements all over the city with bills and newspapers. And in the United States, it was against the law to have a newspaper until 1704. Until 1704. There was actually a newspaper that occurred in 1690, but after that it was banned because it was supposed to be a religious. It was, deemed religiously inappropriate. Next slide, please. Now, one of the biggest advertisers in the early days, I don't think that slide's getting there. Maybe the next slide. Try the next one. There you go. This is a copy of Benjamin Franklin's Philadelphia Gazette from 1728, and you can see that most of the ads are for slaves or escaped slaves or servants, and they're not all black slaves. They're Irish and white slaves as well. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now here's an example of these early advertisements that occurred in the farm journals. And in the farm journals, what you'd see right away is that they would start telling you how to grow barley and wheat and all of these different cover crops. Next slide, please. Next slide. And then in 1911, the Berkshire Society started, and they started promoting sheep production. And so they started cutting down huge amounts of forest. By 1900, 80% of Vermont was a sheep farm, and 20% was left in trees. But there was still a major focus on the part of some of the farmers to try to take care of the soil and take care of the land, and so you see these ads that are that one of them is from 1820 and the other one is 1853, and it's what kinds of crops you use for fallow crops. Next slide, please. And there were insecticides that were used at the time. Whale oil was one of them. Potash, awash, which was really ashes from the fireplace and so forth. And there were different kinds of pesticides that they used, but they were mostly natural based. And that isn't to say that people didn't try arsenic or mercury or lead or whatever else was available, because there were no restrictions then. I mean, of course, there's not that many now, but there were no restrictions then. Next slide, please. And then in 1804, the Alexander von Humboldt didn't really discover guano, but found guano as a European to be an incredible source of fertilizer. And so for the next 50 years, the Europeans and the Americans literally stole all of the guano off the coast of Peru, off of these islands where the guano never got rainfall on it, so it was never leached out. So it became this incredibly well-composted fertilizer. And one of the ways that they got farmers to buy it, because farmers didn't want to buy stuff off farm. They wanted to grow all their own fertilizer, and they wanted to use all their own animal manure for fertilizer. So what they did is they showed this cormorant standing on a bag of Peruvian guano with a fish in its mouth, because people use fish as fertilizer and people use bird manure as fertilizer. No one was using seabird droppings as fertilizer, but everybody was using chicken, turkey, and all other kinds of material. So guano was the first fertilizer that was advertised, and the first fertilizer that was widely accepted. You have to realize that there's been about 200 years of really destructive farming practice on the east coast of the United States before they started using guano. So guano seemed like a miracle to a lot of farmers, but it was a miracle that was short-lived because there wasn't that much guano and they used it up really rapidly. Next slide, please. And here is some Peruvian guano that's sold In the 1880s, there was no Peruvian guano left by the 1880s. It was gone. So this was just a early fake advertisement. They mixed some other guanos with material and sold this stuff, and like it was a scandal. I mean, the fertilizer sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. Depend on the mixture you got. Next slide. Then in the 1840s, a really influential European chemist, Justus von Liebig, started teaching American aristocratic kids that went to Europe to study with him why we needed to look at a scientific chemistry and a scientific agriculture. And so his strategy was, we can use all of these industrial chemicals as fertilizer, and we don't have to use manures, and we don't have to be tied to that manure cycle. And so the next slide, please. So here's his lab in Germany, and you can see that the people in, I don't know if you can see that well, but the people in the lab are all aristocrats. They have top hats on in the lab. And so all of these aristocratic kids came back here, and they taught at Yale and Harvard and the University of California. And what happened as a result of that is we started this whole descent into chemical agriculture, and we started it in the 1840s. So Liebig's idea was, look, we've got all this industrial waste. They found nitrate of soda when they were looking for salt in Peru and Chile, and so they started using nitrate of soda, not just for fertilizer, but for bomb making. And so Liebig said, look, we've got all these waste piles, let's see if we can use those for agriculture. So here in one of the fertilizer books, which was the popular fertilizer book of the day, called Fertilizer by Voorhees, here is a Chilean nitrate propaganda. I mean, and they called it propaganda then. I mean, today we don't call it propaganda. I mean, you just heard Naomi speak, and like our concept of propaganda is like, we're going to do it, but we're going to tell you it's truth, right? And that's what they were trying to do then, but they weren't afraid to call it that. Next slide, please. So here's, we started having all of these different fertilizers they started selling to people. Sulfur, sulfuric acid, an enormous amount of lime that they had discovered, and phosphorus. Next slide, please. And then here's some more ads for these, and these are early ads. These are the 1850s, 1860s. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next one, please. And then they found potash in Germany in the 1840s, and the Germans formed a potash cartel, and the potash they found, again, the same way they found sodium nitrate, they were looking for salt, and potash was overlaying the salt. So they had these mountains of potash, and they were looking for a market, and guess what the biggest market could be? Agriculture, right? And that's the same thing that's happening today, really, when you think about it, because they're trying to take all of this irradiated material, these fuel rods, and use it as fertilizer. They're trying to dump a lot of that stuff on farmland. They're trying to dump sludge on farmland. All these waste products they started using in the 1840s, and we're still using waste products in agriculture today. And then they found phosphorus off the coast of South Carolina. Huge deposits of phosphorus. Well, that got dumped on farmlands and they poured sulfuric acid on it. And so here we are, like already starting to get very toxic. Now, one of the things that happened is farmers rejected all of this stuff. They said, we don't want this stuff. This isn't fertilizer that we think is valuable for our crops or for our land. And so it was a tough sell, but they were able to get the aristocratic farmers to buy into it, because the aristocratic farmers oftentimes were invested in the industries that were creating the waste. So it was in their interest to get rid of the waste, even if it was on their own land. And so they started dumping huge amounts of it on these giant farms. Next slide, please. And during this time, this was a time, of course, of patent medicine. And, you could say just about anything. Of course, they are saying that today, too. You have to keep that in mind. The Fair Trade Commission hasn't done a real good job, or FDA, or the USDA. So here's, this classic side-by-side. One of them says tobacco's a panacea, and King James says it's the worst thing that ever happened to people, right? Well, King James was right. But tobacco was used as a pesticide. We started using nicotine sulfate as a pesticide, and you might see it, in old advertisements called Black Leaf 40. Next slide, please. Next slide. That one looks a little blank. And here's some of the, I'll just run through these ads. This is like a Buffalo Lithia Spring number 2. This is a patent medicine, and it cures all kinds of things. It doesn't just cure gout. It cures indigestion and everything else. And the first pests that were really a problem in the United States were rats and mice and fleas and bugs. And rat catchers took care of most of that. And they actually, had ferrets that they released in buildings that caught rats and so forth. Next slide, please. And you can see, the ads were pretty descriptive. The guy's got this collar on with death to lice. And so this was, nobody had vetted any of these chemicals or any of these patent medicines. It was all you could say anything, and people did say anything. Next slide, please. And people were even, and today we're in about the same place. People went to the clergy to get rid of pests, and here's the clergy trying to get rid of June bugs, right? And I'm still saying, God, how can I take care of these pests today? But I don't really expect her to do it, so. So then in the 1860s, they found out that arsenic, surprise, surprise, would kill Colorado potato beetles, and nothing else seemed to be very effective at that. So what happened is they started spraying this green paint pigment called Paris green on the Colorado potato beetle, and lo and behold, it was effective for several years. Next slide, please. This is actually, that last slide was actually a caution against using Paris green, saying, look, Paris green is a total poison, and it's going to poison your land and poison the food. But then it was effective, and so the large-scale farms started using enormous amounts of arsenic, and more arsenic has been used on U.S. farms than DDT ever was, because arsenic has been used since 1867. Do the math. They were spraying it every year, and they sprayed it up until the 1960s. So a 100-year run of arsenic. And arsenic is still used in ag today. It's not used as much. So then they found out that they wanted to do a liquid spray. And so they found out that London purple and Paris purple, which were waste dye waters from the garment industry, worked really well on as a pesticide. Before that, they were dumping it in the ocean, but then they started dumping it on our food. So I'm not sure exactly how much of an advance that was. Next slide, please. And so then they had to start creating these, protective devices, because people were getting, completely poisoned by this. One of the first devices they had for spraying was just a folded piece of paper. You'd put the arsenic in the middle and you'd blow it onto under the sink or on your crops, and then they finally started using bellows, and then they used bicycle pumps, and then they finally put a canister on the bicycle pump. And in the 1890s they started using lead arsenic, and lead arsenic was you think, oh my God, today, who would be using lead arsenic? So but it was used all the way until the 1960s again, and it became the most common pesticide on fruits and vegetables in the world. And this advertisement actually is from the 1930s, but they started using it as early as the 1890s. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, yeah. So in the 1880s, before the 1880s, the farm magazines were owned by populous publishers. In the 1880s, the life expectancy of those people was diminishing, and those people that were populous sold out to other publishers who they assumed were populous. But in fact, what happened, there was a major mind shift in farm publications about the 1880s, and they started giving the publications away and selling ads for a lot more money. They needed the subscription base to get the ads. So they would give the magazines away, and I don't pay for any of my farm magazines today. You can get every single one of them for free, and you have been able to since the 1880s. And they're really little more than advertising sheets for the chemical companies. Next slide, please. And other companies, farm equipment manufacturers and so forth. Next slide. But mostly the chemical companies. Next slide, please. So this guy that makes Slugshot is promoting advertising here, and this is in 1893. By 1891, people were starting to get mad about pesticides on their food, and here's an article on poison grapes. And this started a safe food movement, our first safe food movement. We've really had three of them. One of them started around this time, and one of the chief proponents of it was Upton Sinclair, who wrote the book The Jungle, and he was probably the first effective food muckraker. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, that's it. Then in around 1807 to 1813, the Germans were freaked out about not having enough nitrogen for bombs and fertilizer, and so they had a crash program. It was their Manhattan Project, and they learned how to extract nitrogen from the atmosphere, because the nitrogen in the atmosphere represents about 78% of the gases in the atmosphere. So this is really the nitrogen planet, and the goal of chemists and physicists was always, how can we get that nitrogen for free that we can use either for growing food or for making bombs. And so one of the processes created was ammonium cyanide, and it created like three products. One of them was ammonium, which was the nitrogen, and then the other one was cyanide, and there were two different gases. One gas was a mild gas, and the other gas was the gas that they used for the final solution in Nazi Germany. And so this guy is, in this total war mode on the farm, spraying cyanide. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah. And the other type of nitrogen fertilizer was called the Haber-Bosch process, and it's been a probably more productive, I guess I would say it's been more productive worldwide. Almost everybody uses that system today. And here's another ad for that. Now I'd like to say one thing about this, and that is that I'm going to finish up here because I don't have any time left. But I can show more of these slides in the workshop if people are interested in seeing these slides. We've only seen about 20 of them, and some of the slides I want to show you are from Dr. Seuss, because Dr. Seuss was probably the most important pesticide salesperson in history. And so I have a bunch of slides on that, and kind of let you see how effective he was at getting people to be comfortable with using chemicals on themselves. Now, we're organic farmers, and I've worked on a lot of farms where I've had to use chemicals, and I'm opposed to them. I don't think we need them. I think it's like a industrial business decision that we decided to use that. these chemicals, and we don't need them. I mean, we grow 50 acres of vegetables and melons and probably about 300 different crops in Vermont, and we don't use any chemicals. And I haven't used any chemicals on farms that I've run since 1972. So thanks a lot. If anybody's interested, come to the workshop, and appreciate it.